So, good evening. Well, good evening for me. Good morning for most of you. Thank you for joining again. Today would have been, or this week would have been, the week of the next intensive, which I postponed till next year. The intensive was going to be on integration and critical thinking. And it's quite an important topic, thinking well, and yet it has to be looked at relatively, because if we say, oh, it's an important topic, and look at it absolutely, we'll judge poor thinking. We'll judge a lack of critical thinking. And if we judge that, that becomes another form of our own suffering. If we judge it in ourselves, if we judge it in others, it becomes another form of our own suffering. And so this notion of how can I think and relate to something as it being important, and at the same time not therefore be attached to it, meaning how can I say something is important and then not judge it when it's not there? Meaning, how can I say, okay, it's important for me to think a certain way, and then not judge myself or judge another when the thinking in a particular way doesn't happen? In the same way, how can we say that pleasure is, or certain outcomes are pleasurable and certain outcomes are painful, and not be attached to the pleasurable outcomes happening and the painful outcomes not happening? And these sort of nuances fit into the category of critical thinking, or understanding these nuances would be a type of critical thinking. And it's the way that our relationship to concepts forms is that often the nuances that are part of our critical thinking development, when we start looking at our thinking and we start seeing the failings, what we see is that certain relationships towards concepts have set in place where things aren't really understood, and various lines of thought aren't being followed. There's a lot of crossover. And then when there's crossover on lines of thinking, we think that we're dealing with something correctly, but in fact we're not, and we don't see that we're not. So this particular nuance of how can we think something is important and not be attached to it. So in fact, one of the ways, because our understanding isn't often very nuanced, spiritual teachings will even work with that. And instead of trying to get our understanding to be nuanced, they work with our unnuanced understanding. And an example of that is that instead of saying that the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, they will say there is no such thing as pleasure or pain. There is just what is. Because as soon as if what is described as pleasurable or painful, good or bad, intelligent or unintelligent, the teaching understands that automatically, as soon as something is called good, there will be an attachment to it. There will be, oh, it's good, I want that. And if something else is bad, oh, I don't want that. If we label something as good, we say, oh, I want that, and I need you to deliver good and not bad. So in order to get around this way of thinking, a spiritual teaching will actually say, oh, there is no such thing as good or bad. There is no such thing as right and wrong. It just is. And in doing that, it's taking away the label. And in taking away the label, our automatic attachment to something doesn't get triggered as easily as it would when the label is placed in there. Now, this seeing everything as just what is also very valid. It's not that saying things just are what they are is just a bypassing. It's not just a way of dealing with the attachment issue. There is a perspective that allows us, and that we should see and understand what it is meant by things just are what they are. There is no good or bad. There is no right or wrong. Because that statement is very valid. Now, if we take that statement and take it absolutely, because let's say we come to see it, we come to see that, oh, if I don't label anything, it just is what it is. And even if I label it, it is part of life that I don't have control over. So I might as well not label it if my labeling is going to turn create a judgment and create an extra layer. If we just say, well, it's pleasure, but it is what it is, or it's pain and it is what it is, meaning it is coming from life and I'm not the one that's in control of it, that life is always going to be something. And so therefore, instead of me saying, in this moment is pleasurable and I like it, and I want more of this, and then in the next moment, if it's not so pleasurable, and go, in this moment it's not pleasurable and I don't want so much of this, we can come to a place where we understand that whatever comes next is not my doing. It's just part of life. And life is going to be a mix of whatever comes, a mix of, if we want to describe it one way, a mix of pleasure sometimes and pain at other times. But because it comes from a source that is not in our control, in a way we can say, well, whatever it is, pleasure or pain, it just is what it is. And so seeing it from that point of view is very important. So there's two ways. There is that we see the pleasure and the pain as not in our control, and so therefore it is what it is. Or we see, if I don't think about it, or often when there is pleasure or pain, I'm forced to go into a thinking about it, a judgment, and that creates a whole different layer of the experience. And so we can come to see, if I don't go into a story about it, if I don't allow myself to start imagining something different, wanting it to be different, then you're just left with the circumstance, and there isn't that extra layer on top of the circumstance. Now, so there's a lot of validity in being able to just come into the silence from just saying it is what it is, and I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to experience, move on, and deal with it as best I can, but no secondary thinking. It just is what it is. So there's a lot of validity in that. However, there's also a part of functioning in daily life that needs us to be able to discern and think about things in order to deal with them, in order for us to produce good outcomes or solutions to things. And to just say it is what it is not necessarily that useful. sometimes when needing to look at a problem and sort it out on the flow of life level, which might include assessing things and calculating things. And so this is where we need to be flexible, and we need to understand that these perspectives that are given shouldn't be held as absolutes, because if they're held as absolutes, they tend to then debilitate another aspect of our functioning. So I maybe I haven't got to the point very well yet. I was saying, how can we value something and not be attached to it? So this question revolves around attachment to outcomes, which is really the crux of our suffering. It is the core of the psychological self that is forced to feel uncomfortable and in resistance with life. Attachment to outcomes, which really means the deeply ingrained, unconscious, unquestioned, unseen belief. And when I say belief, you don't even need to know that you have it. Someone might say, well, I don't really believe that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, because they might not know that that belief is ingrained. When a belief of this sort is ingrained, meaning really part of our structure, we can see that it's there by looking at the response, the feeling, the reactions. And the core of the psychological self, that which dissolves when liberation from suffering sets in. So if there is going to be liberation from suffering, it means that this aspect of the human being has dissolved. So the core of our unenlightenment, the core of our suffering, is the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness, who I am, essentially, who I am, is defined by and dependent on outcomes. That's, if we had to boil it down to one description of what our suffering, what human suffering is based on or stems from, it's this deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And if that is in place, something that I suggest has been set in place by life at a very, very far back, and is functioning presently, or is part of who we are if it's in place, we're then forced to, if that's in place, we're forced to seek outwardly and try and control circumstance. Because the deeply ingrained belief that says my happiness is dependent on outcomes, meaning who I am, I will only be complete, is another way of saying it. I will only be complete when circumstances a certain way. If that belief is in place, it makes outcomes so important. Think about it. My happiness, right? If I say it that way, if we say my happiness is to be found in outcomes, it might not seem like outcomes are that important, but well, yeah, we say, oh, happiness, yes, it's important, but it's not that important. But what it means by my happiness really means who I am is dependent on what happens in life. That's what the deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes means. Who I am, my very existence, my completeness, and we feel incomplete. And we say my completeness will one day be there when outcomes are right. So that's why it makes outcomes so important, because it's directly linked to our sense of self. And our sense of self feels unsatisfied, it feels uncomfortable, it feels incomplete, and it is seeking completeness and satisfaction. And it believes that that is to be found in outcomes, and therefore whatever happens on the outside is essentially the cause of our uncomfortableness in life. And so we will fight that. We will resist it. We won't accept it. We can't accept it. How can we accept outcomes being not as we would like when we think that that is what is causing the problem in life? So we will fight it. It means we won't have equanimity. We won't find acceptance happening. So this is the point in all of the talking. In the first 15 minutes of my talking, essentially, I'd like to emphasize that that is the crux of the psychological self, a deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that we can call attachment to outcomes. And the message, this incidentally, if we look at Buddhism as I came across it in a sort of very condensed and abbreviated, summarized version, I think I came across it in a fairly summarized version. I didn't ever go into Buddhism in a very dedicated way as a Buddhist, but it supplemented, it came in various ways in support of this movement towards peace of mind. And the line that I remember striking me is that, I don't know if it was summarized this way in a book or if I melted it down to this, but essentially I related to the teachings of Buddha as saying, enlightenment is the end of suffering. So if someone says, what's enlightenment? What is this enlightenment? Buddha's answer, as I came across it, was enlightenment is the end of suffering. He didn't say, put it any other way. So imagine we could say enlightenment is peace of mind. We might say, what would Roger say enlightenment is? And someone might say, oh, I think he'd say enlightenment is peace of mind, continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living. But you'd also know that very often I'd say, and what peace of mind is, really is the absence of, the non-existence, the non-arising of guilt and blame and pride and worry and suffering. Guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation and attachment to outcomes. So it is the absence of that. All of that is suffering. So enlightenment, you could say, is peace of mind, but more accurately, peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And the next part of the deductive reasoning that is given, or the hint, the cause of suffering is attachment. What is attachment? Attachment is the belief that I need, or attachment is the relationship, the attitude towards pleasure and pain or outcomes. It says, the outcome is very important. It is what will make me complete. And what is the cause of attachment? Desire is the cause of attachment. If we think something is going to give us happiness, then we are going to desire it. So that was the crux of it from my interpretation of Buddhism. It's because we think that outcomes are so important, because we have this desire for love, we have this desire for money, we have this desire for fame, we have this desire for sex or material gain. A desire that is linked to the belief that found in those things. That is what causes suffering. So if you find yourself in strong resistance with outcomes, strong resistance with the flow of life and what's happening in the flow of life, then it is what it is. It's happening because the structure is a certain way. But hopefully, a part of us says, this is my valuing of outcomes. This is what's happening. My valuing of outcomes is happening on an unconscious level. And because the outcome has been valued as part of what will define me, what will make me complete, there is the inability to move on and to not get involved. So what does it mean when we say your happiness is not to be found in outcomes? Your completeness is not to be found in outcomes. What it's pointing at is the fact that there is a sense of self that delivers inherently in it. It's not just a sense of self, it is the self, the real self. There is an aspect of the human being, the real self, that is self-content, is self-confirming, is complete. If we know ourselves as the one that will be at peace, will be happy, will be complete when outcomes are a certain way. We don't know ourselves. We have an imagination, a concept of ourselves. We are essentially knowing ourselves on the psychological level, on a conceptual level. So if there is this deeply ingrained movement towards outcomes, it means that the psychological self is what is at play. And that psychological self is by and large at play for all of humanity and has always been at play for all of humanity, which means by and large, we don't know this self. It is covered up. It is obscured. it's obscured by a habit, meaning a concept of who we are that keeps saying, yes, my happiness will be out there. So if we stop for a second, if that psychological self hasn't been weakened, it's going to kick in again and say, okay, now get on with it again. And it will start thinking and feeling as it always has. And as the psychological self gets weaker and weaker, and more contact with the part of ourself that is outside of that psychological self, that is what we could say more true, more real. It's not conceptual. Now, when I talk about the conceptual self or the psychological self, which is what most of us know ourselves as, there's no notion that I know myself as on a psychological level, or I know the psychological me. It doesn't stand out as being the presence of a psychological me or the presence of a me that is not the real me, because it's all we've ever known. It becomes much more evident that this is the case when we bump into the self, when the self presents itself. And what presents itself is silence, or an abiding in the space outside of the psychological flow of thought. And when that space opens up, it becomes so clear that I have been engaging in life from an idea of how life should be, an idea of how I should be, an idea of how the other should be. And our experience of life, our experience of who I am, essentially is an experience of a continuous commentary, essentially judgment, of whatever is happening, whatever has happened, whatever might happen. And when that just shuts up, then a self that is not all of that noise, which hasn't appeared as noise until the contrast happens. When the silence of the true self is there, then it becomes so apparent that this other conceptual self has been all we've known ourselves as. So life, this is the rule, life is not going to be great circumstantially all of the time, culminating in the fact that we're going to die. That people we like are going to die, that people that we trust are going to let us down from time to time, that decisions we make that we're sure were great decisions or going to lead to a good outcome turn out not to lead to a good outcome. And there will be the positive things. People that we like will appear in our life. People that we trust will continue to act in a way that makes us value them and makes us appreciate them. So one of the rules is life is going to be a mixed bag. And that's it working. The mixed bag is life working. And when we look at the other and we say, okay, well, they delivered pleasure to me, or they delivered pain to me. That's part of the problem. If we look at the other as an autonomous entity, then we look at, let's say, government, and we say, oh, government is delivering this pain to me. Government is just a color of life. Your neighbor is just a color of life. Your brother and sister, mother, father, partner, friends, they're just different colors of life. It's all life delivering pleasure or pain to you. And yourself is a color of life, your own actions, your own decisions. That is just life happening through you. And those outcomes are not in our control, and they're a bit of a mystery until they happen. So if we can get it into our head that life is working when pain is being delivered, and it's working when pleasure is being delivered, because life is a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. This is very useful because it doesn't mean that we're not necessarily going to become involved and attach and therefore see our attachment to pleasure. That will still happen, but it will allow us to see it. It'll allow us to investigate it, become aware of it, be interested in it. And the more interested in it we are, the more we will see the nuances and the particulars of it, in our case, in our own experience. And one of the rules is that attachment, as it arises inside us, meaning resistance to things that have happened, not biological resistance in the moment, but more the psychological extension of that over extended periods of time, i.e. not being able to move on, being haunted by a commentary, by a judgment, by a blame, by a shame, by an embarrassment over what has happened. One of the rules is that, yes, it might continue to happen, but that is not truth. That is not seeing things clearly. If we can understand that suffering is error. Now, once again, if we label something as error, can we label something as error and not resist it? This is where discernment hopefully can start to set in, as opposed to judgment. So if you are driving and you don't drive very well, can you say, oh, I didn't park the car very well? Not with judgment, just objectively, you get out of the car and you realize you parked over the white line. So you look at it and you just say, I didn't park very well. I know I didn't park very well because one of the wheels is over the white line into the next parking bay. So it's not up for debate or anything. You can just see it and you go, that is not well done. But there doesn't have to be a judgment over it. So understanding that suffering, when it arises, is error. It's a misunderstanding of who we are. So if a painful outcome happens, if your car breaks down, you can say, this is not good. Why is it not good? It's not good relative to a certain outcome. So this is not good relative to me getting to my appointment on time. That's like looking at the white line and going, that is not good parking. The wheel is into the next car bay. So when the car breaks down, it is not good relative to the objective of getting to the appointment on time. Now, can we say that without it turning into suffering? We can if we are clear that outcomes, although relatively important, are not absolutely important. So it means outcomes are not a definition of who I am. If I don't get to the appointment, I might lose my job. Right? So relatively, it could be important to get to the appointment on time. But if I lose my job, which might mean financial hardship, is that an attack on who I am? And the answer is no. It might well be an attack on my pleasure in life, but it isn't an attack on who I am at my core. So if I got the news, I'm sorry, you have been too unreliable for whatever reasons, we need to find someone who can fulfill the job requirements better than you can. So as of next week, your employment is terminated. If we have a connection to the core of who we are, we simultaneously might say, this is not good relative to my financial stability, for example. But as far as my sense of who I am is, or as far as who I am is, losing the job or gaining the job doesn't add or take away anything from who I really am. And there isn't much point in just saying that. We need to be able to be that which is unaffected, untouched by the losing of the job. Now, someone might hear this and say, oh, it's all well and good for you to say this, right? It's not you that has lost your job. But what I mean is, it's much more absolute than just this example of losing a job. It's what can mean that we are okay with, at some point, being told that you have a terminal illness and you will die. It is what will allow us to be okay with the fact that a partner that we have lived with for 25 years suddenly meets someone else and falls in love and leaves. Now, all of these things are going to be painful. The normal psychological response to pain is, this is an attack on who I am. And there is essentially, for a while, for however long that movement carries on, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no sense of peace or equanimity. There is no connection, no groundedness, no sense that everything is okay. There is a tsunami, a hurricane of thoughts about what this means about me. And that usually happens because the ground of self isn't cultivated. And so we're buffeted in between what Nisargadatta, buffeted between the shores of pleasure and pain, is that if circumstance is good, then there are less things that trigger our uncomfortableness. But as soon as circumstance is bad, we are forced into this thinking and feeling like now I am not complete because of the circumstance. So critical thinking, where does that come into it? In order for us to be able to think about this and see where, for example, attachment is in place, be able to see where we believe things, and then start to see that we shouldn't believe this because there are bits of information, even though we believe it and it's deeply ingrained, maybe a part of us starts to see opposing information in our field that starts to tell us, oh, we shouldn't be believing it. Believing whatever we believe about, let's say, our happiness to be found in outcomes. Maybe we start getting a sense and finding some time when peace of mind is there, even when outcomes are not as we would like. So that's very valuable feedback, very valuable experience. If we find a silence, a quietness, a non-involvement, then at least we know that it's possible. And so when it kicks up in the way where there is suffering, maybe we can see, look, here is the feelings that say it's all about my happiness and outcomes, but I have my own experience of times in the past when I have felt at peace, even when the outcomes weren't great. So that might then tell us, this is not something I have to believe absolutely, because I have seen in the past, I know that there is the possibility to be at peace even when outcomes are not great. And so then we start being able to catch out our own suffering as error, because our suffering is saying, no, this is very important. In the moment, it's saying, no, this is very important. We can't just let this be. And the part of our critical thinking comes in and says, no, I don't think it's actually as important as my system is shouting out at the moment. Because I know that there have been times when there was a peace of mind, and peace of mind was the sort of saying, yes, it's not great, but it's acceptable. It's acceptable is simply the absence of the non-acceptability. So this thing about outcomes, they're not in our control. Let's take, or be controversial again, let's look at the current health situation. My stance is that basically everyone can make their own decision. It really doesn't bother me much what decision people make, because I think I'm pretty clear on the fact that life is a mixed bag and it is what it is. So if someone says, well, I don't agree with your way of looking at it, that's life. I'm okay with that. But let's look at some mathematics. If there's a game and you were you had to put $50 into play. And there are 7 number ones in the hat. There are 2 number 2s and 1 number 3. And you put $50 in, and if the number that you pick is pulled out of the hat, you get your $50 back and another $50. So mathematically speaking, there is a right number to choose. So you get to choose. You can either pick 1, 2, or 3. Remember, there are 7 1s, 2 2s, and 1 3 in the hat. So 10 pieces of paper. On 7 of them, there is the number 1. On 2 of them, there is the number 2. And on 1 of them, there is the number 3. And you have to pay $50 to play. And if the number you pick is pulled out of the hat, you get your $50 back and another $50. And if the number you pick is not pulled out of the hat, then you lose your $50. So let's say you didn't have a choice whether you play or not. They say you have to play. So you've all put your $50 in. It's been taken off you, essentially. Now, what number do you pick? There is one theoretical right answer, and that is number 1 is the number you should pick. That doesn't mean that number 1 is going to come out of the hat. It just means the odds are in your favor if you choose number 1. And if you chose number 3, that is the least odds. So if you choose number 3, it's 1 in 10. If you choose number 2, it's 2 in 10. If you choose number 1, it's 7 in 10. So there's no arguing with the fact that theoretically, the right answer to this is number 1. But the right answer doesn't mean that you're going to win. It just means it's the best based on all of the taking everything into account. So if someone picks number 2 on a objective assessment, I'd say you've made the wrong decision. And if someone picks number 3, I say, well, you've really made the wrong decision objectively. But now we get to the picking of the number out of the hat. So the number comes out, and the person who picked number 3, well, we're playing one at a time. Number 3 gets picked out of the hat, and they say, you see, I was right. I said, no, you weren't right. You were wrong, but you got lucky. And the problem is we look at outcomes to decide whether we were right or wrong. And life is about making a decision, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. If we can make decisions with good information and being able to process that information, we can make essentially better decisions. The outcome still is not in our control. Now, if I see someone making a decision that I think is mathematically or critical thinking wise not the right decision, should I judge them for that? If I do judge them, that becomes my own suffering. So can we have this capacity to be able to see someone as wrong objectively and allow that, have space for that, in the scheme of things, understanding that even though theoretically they're wrong, they may well have made the best choice. So all of this essentially is just to get you to think about decisions, outcomes, and how they're not in our control, and how we can have an objectively right answer or a theoretical right answer, and that the theoretical right answer might lead to a bad result, and the theoretical right answer might lead to a good result. And whether we think, even if we think we have the theoretical right answer, we might have calculated it wrong. So at some point we have to say, I don't even know if I'm right with my theoretical right answer. I can only function the way that I am designed to function. Now, so if we go to this point and say, I can only function the way I'm designed to function, that is good from our peace of mind point of view. That is helpful from the point of view of peace of mind. But to use that, I can only function to the best of my ability, doesn't necessarily help, or it's not a good excuse when it comes to another objective. So let's be clear that that is an attitude that is essential for peace of mind. But it's not necessarily an attitude that is useful for getting the best objective, let's say, or the best outcome. But if we hear that, then we say, oh, I need to have a better design then, because I want the best outcome. And that might not be available. So be clear for yourself on what it is that you're seeking. What is it that's most important? And maybe there's nothing getting in the way of being able to have both. Being able to use one part of your assessment to determine outcomes without being attached to the outcome. Saying, I would like the best outcome, so I'm going to apply to the best of my ability relative thinking to get a good outcome, but I know that in the end, the outcome is not in my control. So whether we can think critically or not is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And ultimately, if we can come to the conclusion that, well, I'll do my best in any moment, I'll function, that is my best. If we've come to the conclusion, I'll do my best, but my best is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, that in itself is a critical thinking conclusion. To function according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and then for me to say, oh, I should have done better. I should have done it differently. You should have done it differently. That, to me, is a lack of critical thinking. But what can we do? We're not necessarily equipped to see these things. The feeling is that we are in control of what we pick. We are in control of the outcomes, that we are in control of how much intelligence or lack of intelligence we apply to a problem. And so because that feeling is there, the more objective seeing of the fact that, if we haven't got certain experience in a situation or with a task, we're possibly not going to do it very well. And we can't do it well because it's not part of our up-to-date conditioning. So if there's any questions, I'll take all questions and answers.